I said yes for a long time. It was my way of surviving. To be needed. To be accepted. To be someone who wouldn't be left behind. I said yes to work I didn't love. Yes to people who didn't hear me. Yes to meetings that were exhausting. Yes to words I didn't want to say. Because I thought that no was a rejection of love. That no was a risk. That no was loneliness. I was praised for being open. For always being there. Always ready to help. Always listening, supporting, getting involved. And I was proud of it. Because it meant that I was good. That I was important. That I was needed. But over time, I began to notice that my yes was no longer sincere. I said it automatically. Without desire. Without energy. Without myself. I was stepping over tiredness. Because of reluctance. Because of my own limits. And each time I became a little less alive. I didn't know how to say no. The word seemed rude to me. Dangerous. As if it would destroy everything I had built. As if it would make me a stranger. But I was already a stranger to myself. I lived in America where yes is currency. Here they don't ask if you're tired. Here they ask if you're ready. Whether you're available. Whether you're comfortable. I agreed. Smiled. I was silent. But something inside was breaking. I began to feel that every yes was a betrayal. Not loud. Not dramatic. But quiet. Like a drop sharpening a stone. I didn't ask myself how I felt. I asked, what else should I do? I learned to ignore the signals. When I couldn't sleep, I opened my laptop. When I didn't want to eat, I drank coffee. When I didn't want to talk, I wrote stories. I forced myself to be present where I wasn't. And my body paid for it. I would wake up feeling like I had been hit by a car. Everything hurt. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't get up. I would lie there wondering, what's wrong with me? And the answer was simple. I was exhausted. Not tired. Namely exhausted. Exhausted. Devastated. I didn't want to admit it. Because admitting it meant stopping. And stopping was defeat. Or so I thought. But my body no longer gave me a choice. It wouldn't listen. It didn't want to get up. And for the first time I didn't force it. I stayed home. I turned off the sound on my phone. I didn't answer. I didn't create. I didn't prove. I just lay there. And stared at the ceiling. The hours passed. I didn't count them. I didn't plan what I would do tomorrow. I didn't think about what I would tell people. Just was. It was scary. Because I didn't know who I was without action. Without movement. Without results. But my body thanked me. It didn't hurt. Didn't scream. Just kept quiet. And I kept quiet with it. I started to notice little things. How the light falls on the wall. How tea smells when you don't rush. How the air moves when you open the window. I wasn't looking for meaning. I just allowed myself to be in the moment. It wasn't a revelation. It wasn't a victory. It was a beginning. The beginning of listening. The beginning of respect. The beginning of a relationship with myself. Not as a function but as a living being. I realized that no is not aggression. It's not rejection. It's not selfishness. No is a way of saying I am. Have boundaries. Have a right. Have myself. And I no longer want to betray myself for the sake of someone else's comfort. When I came to the US, it seemed to me that it would be a new beginning. A country of freedom where you can be yourself. Where you don't have to explain why you're silent. Where you can just live. But America doesn't ask if you're tired. It asks if you're ready. If you're available. If you're comfortable. And I agreed to everything. To extra hours. To other people's expectations. To silence when I wanted to speak. Because I was afraid of missing a chance. Losing trust. Losing myself. Even though I was already starting. I lived in a room where there was no silence. Only the noise of compromises. I worked, kept quiet, smiled. And every yes was like another stone in the backpack I was carrying. I thought that was how it should be. That it was adaptation. That it was adulthood. But it was the loss of my voice. My first no in America wasn't loud. I simply didn't come. To a meeting that wasn't mine. To a conversation that didn't make sense. I stayed home. And for the first time in a long time I breathed. It was scary. I thought they would kick me out. That they would say, "You're not a team player." That I would lose everything I had built. But nothing happened. The world went on. People went on with their business. And I stayed. And it was a revelation. That no is not the end. It's the beginning. The beginning of myself. I started trying again. I refused to work extra hours. I didn't answer right away. I didn't agree to everything. And every no was like a step. A step towards myself. A step towards a space where I didn't have to be comfortable. Where I could be real. I noticed how my attitude towards myself changed. I no longer forced myself to be where I didn't want to be. I no longer agreed to what exhausted me. I no longer apologized for my limits. And it didn't make me tough. It made me honest. I realized that dignity is not something that is given to me. This is what I no longer give away. I didn't have to be always good to be valuable. I didn't have to be always available to be important. I learned to be myself, even when it was uncomfortable. I learned not to explain every no. I learned not to be afraid of losing those who only love me when I'm convenient. And that was liberating. I no longer lived in fear. I no longer lived in compromise. I no longer lived in a role. I just lived. I worked in a place where respect was measured by productivity. How much you did. How much you endured. How much you didn't say. There was no space for pause. There was no time for "I can't." There was a system that valued the result but not the person. I saw how people broke down. How they kept quiet. How they agreed. Because they thought it was the right thing to do. Thought the same way. Kept quiet too. I also endured. Because I was afraid of losing my place. I was afraid of losing trust. I was afraid of losing myself. Although I was already starting to. But something in me began to change. I no longer wanted to be a function. I wanted to be a person. I wanted to have the right to be tired. To refuse. To the limit. I began to say no. At first quietly. Carefully. To tasks that were not mine. To a pace that destroyed me. To expectations that did not take into account my soul. It was not easy. I heard. "You are difficult. You are not a team player. You are not American." But I was worthy. And it didn't depend on their words. Dignity is not something they give you in a contract. It's not a bonus. It's not a privilege. It's something deeper. It's an inner knowing. I have the right to be myself. I have the right to disagree. I have the right not to explain. I have the right to be alive, not comfortable. I began to notice how my space changed. People who were used to my yes began to move away. They felt uncomfortable. They felt strange. They felt uncomfortable. But I no longer wanted to be comfortable for others if it meant discomfort for myself. I no longer wanted to be the one who always can. Because I can't always. And that's okay. I learned not to apologize for my boundaries. I learned not to explain every no. I learned not to be afraid to be uncomfortable. And it was new. It was honest. It was mine. I no longer lived in fear. I no longer lived in compromise. I no longer lived in a role. I simply lived. I realized that dignity is not something that is given to me. It is something that I no longer give away. I thought for a long time that boundaries were something rigid. Something that distances. Something that creates distance. Something that says, "I don't want to be with you." But over time I realized, boundaries are not about distance. They are about closeness that doesn't destroy. About honesty that doesn't hurt. About love that doesn't erase you. I started building boundaries. Not as a defense, but as a language. A language that I used to say, "I am. I have the right. I don't have to." These were simple things. I said, "I can't do it now. I need time. I'm not ready." And it wasn't about weakness. It was about respect for myself and for the other. First, it was awkward. I was afraid that people would be offended. That they would say, "You've changed." that they would turn away. But those who stayed close didn't demand an explanation. They accepted my no as part of me. And it was new. It was real. I learned not to be afraid of being uncomfortable. I learned not to be afraid of being myself. I learned not to be afraid of being honest. And every no became a gesture of love. To myself. To others. To life. I no longer agreed to meetings that were exhausting. I didn't respond immediately when I didn't have the resources. I didn't force myself to be where I wasn't. And it didn't make me indifferent. It made me alive. I began to notice how my space changed. There was more silence in it. More pauses. More choices. I no longer lived in should mode. I lived in can mode. And it was new. It was honest. It was mine. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors that I can open when I'm ready. It's not no forever. It's no now. It's not refusal. It's caring. It's not aggression. It's clarity. I'm no longer afraid to say, I'm not ready. 'Cause it's not a cry. It's not a protest. It's not an insult. It's just the truth. And the truth is also love. This is not a story about how I became perfect. It is not a story about how I learned to always react correctly. It is a story about how I stopped betraying myself. How I started listening. How I started choosing. How I learned to be myself, even when it's uncomfortable. I no longer say yes to be loved. I no longer say yes to not be left. I no longer say yes to be good. I say yes when it's mine, when it's sincere, when it's loving. And I say no when I need to, when it protects me, when it preserves my dignity. I realized that no is not the end. It's the beginning of myself, the beginning of respect, the beginning of relationships where I don't disappear. I'm no longer afraid to be uncomfortable. I'm not afraid to be honest. I'm not afraid to be alive. I live in America, in a country where pace is the currency. Where yes is an expectation. Where no is a challenge. And I accept this challenge. Not as a protest, but as a choice. As a way to be within myself. As a way not to lose myself in other people's expectations. I no longer live in fear. I no longer live in compromises. I no longer live in a role. I simply live. And it's not always easy. But it's always honest. I am Valak. I have learned to say no and remain dignified. Because dignity is not something that is given to me. It is something that I no longer give.